Whoa, well, this one came out of nowhere, guys. It's showtime, folks. So Longlegs is a 2024 horror thriller film directed by Osgood Perkins, starring Maika Monroe and Nicolas Cage. Monroe plays an FBI agent, Lee Harker, in the 1990s, who is tasked with tracking down Nick Cage's Longlegs, who's been a serial killer that's been on the run since the 1970s. Honestly, guys, this one wasn't even on my radar. Like, I had heard the term Longlegs, and I had heard the name Longlegs, and I might have caught it like on Instagram, just like kind of shuffling through just the title card, Longlegs. But guys, I was completely blind as to what this movie was about. So like going into this movie, I had no idea. I honestly only found out it was a horror movie because my buddy decided to text me the day before saying, "Are you checking out Longlegs this week?" And I said, I didn't even know I didn't know it was coming out at all this weekend. So I didn't know anything about it, and I found out it was a horror movie through him. So that was just, like I said, I went in there completely blind, guys. I had no expectations. Other than the fact that, like I've said before in previous videos, that when I see Nick Cage's name, I'm always sold on it. You know what I mean? So I was looking forward to seeing Nick Cage in some movie, but I didn't know what all to expect from it. And holy crap if this didn't come out of nowhere. So let's get right into it, guys. This is a solid movie. If you're just waiting for the gun-ho kind of just answer, if I had to give it just like that, this one's pretty solid as far as horror thriller goes. Now we're going to get into a couple of things about it, some of the pros, some of the cons, but just if I needed to give you an answer right out the gate, this is pretty solid for a horror thriller movie. It's definitely not for everyone, so hold your horses. If you need to know a little bit of the cons, it's definitely not for everyone, but I enjoyed it and it was solid. So getting into a couple of things that I enjoyed about this movie, we're going to start with the camera work. There's unique decisions made in this movie as it comes to the camera work. One of them being like the aspect ratio of the camera. So this movie is told in present day versus flashbacks. And every time that there's a flashback, you get this narrow aspect ratio of the camera. It's like a little square that you see on the screen. So all the sides are blocked out and all you have is this square. And it really works as far as making you focus on what is going on in that portion of the scene as far as the flashback goes. And I think it was executed very well. Another thing you get with this movie are these real just like dead shot slow zooms into the main characters and kind of just like these wide aspect shots compared to those narrow shots that really feed into the tension and the isolation feel of this movie. And it works very, very well as far as making you feel what our lead protagonist feels, Lee Harker. You feel that isolation, you feel that kind of just worry and that tension that is built because of the camera work. And it's nothing too flashy or anything like that. Like you're not getting anything, you know, highly technical or anything like that. But those slow pans and those slow zooms and the holding steady shots, seeing the landscape and just kind of just focusing in on the character and whatever the subject is of that scene, it really plays into that isolation feel, that tension building, and I think it works very well for this film. Another pro I had for this film is the Oregon atmosphere is captured well. So it's also helped by the fact that, you know, in the 1990s especially, there was like infamous serial killers that were going around through that part of the country. That kind of plays into what we know about the region in the 1990s. And that helps build a little bit more of the tension in this movie. But that Oregon atmosphere where this movie takes place is captured well. For those of you guys that don't know, good old Chuco is a proud Texan, loud, proud, rowdy Texan, you know what I mean? But I did spend some time in Oregon. I spent 3 years living out there. And I, for one, can tell you that the Oregon atmosphere is captured pretty dang well in Longlegs. You get those really, you know, that moody feel, the darkness of the rain clouds and just the forest and that kind of just like that, for lack of a better term, the vibe of the winter months in Oregon. You definitely get that in this film, and they do a very good job of capturing the mood of this movie. It's just this engulfing kind of like despair. Not that Oregon is all that there's not that much, you know what I mean. Sorry, Oregon, you know what I mean. But the engulfing nature of the mood, the tension, the kind of despair, the lack of hope in this movie, you really get that with the location of Oregon, and I think that atmosphere is captured well. So like the general dread that Lee Harker is feeling with this case of kind of chasing Longlegs, this sense of dread is captured well. And I think the Oregon atmosphere, the use of like natural lighting versus just no light at all, it really works well. And that setting of Oregon is a pretty it's a character in itself. I think it works well. This is also heightened by the sense that something is just kind of looming through the clouds or in the forest, something that's just beyond our comprehension, beyond our reach as a viewer. There's something there, and Longlegs kind of plays with your emotions that way. They also kind of sprinkle in this supernatural element that if you're an eagle-eyed viewer, you're gonna catch it throughout the movie, where they're just kind of sprinkling these things out there. But the setting of Oregon and kind of like the looming overcast and everything like that, it kind of sets it up to where like just there's something sitting out in the woods, or there's something sitting in that little dark corner, and it just plays very well, and it's something that I think is executed very well. While on the topic, I think this film also does something well when it draws inspiration from real life events or real world topics that were going on specifically in the time. Kind of like I said a little bit earlier, it kind of feeds into this like danger that is presented by Longlegs. So there are letters in this movie that are reminiscent, especially like of Zodiac, the Zodiac killer, both the fictional film Zodiac and the actual Zodiac killer. So like you get letters with the symbols and stuff like that that kind of play into the danger that Longlegs presents. So what I've been hearing a lot of is you get these comparisons to the Silence of the Lambs. And as far as like thrillers go and whatnot, I can see that's a fair comparison, but this movie is still unique to itself. You know what I mean? It borrows certain elements of the film, of different films and different real life, you know, serial killers, but it's also unique in itself in the way it applies it. So you see connections to people like Charles Manson and Gary Ridgway, people that are infamous for being, you know, notorious serial killers, but at the same time, Longlegs is his own killer. He has his own identity in this movie, and I think that is executed well. And the use of real life events, as unfortunate as they are, they play into the tension of this movie. They kind of give these character traits to Longlegs, to Nick Cage's character, and it really plays into like that foreboding presence that he has. You know what I mean? Nick Cage is not a great guy in this movie at all, and he plays the character well. And this is all tied into, like I said, real life people that were kind of just influences on the Nick Cage character. So that is something that is done well as far as adding to the tension and adding to the danger that is Longlegs. Further, I think this is something that really helps the viewer connect to the situation that Lee Harker is facing. As far as like, Lee Harker is not exactly the most physically intimidating of the agents. She's actually kind of withdrawn. She's quiet. She's kind of clairvoyant, and they kind of get into that right in the beginning of the movie, so that's not too much of a spoiler. She has this kind of like outsider element to her. With that, with the way the camera works, with the way the film portrays her, you're feeling the danger that she feels. You're kind of understanding that this world that she's in, she is being thrust into situations that are, she's a rookie. So it's like one of those things where she was just assigned to this new case because she has a chance at cracking it. And you're really kind of pulling for her to make it, but at the same time, you feel the elements of danger that she's feeling. So I think with the connections to real life events and real life character traits from these actual serial killers that are being applied to Longlegs, the audience kind of feels that foreboding kind of tension that Lee Harker's feeling, and you're with her all the way through the ride. And that's done well. Another thing I enjoyed about this movie is the use of color or lack thereof. The subdued tones really play into like the atmosphere of the Oregon setting, and it also plays into like the foreboding nature of the movie. You know what I mean? You get these subdued, like I said, you get subdued kind of colors, but at the same time you see crimson colors, this kind of dark reddish color that I think is used to signify the evil that is kind of engulfing and lurking around Lee Harker. And this movie is definitely one of those like really dark, moody movies. Like there's very little joy or kind of sense of good that is surrounding our characters in this movie. Most of this is just really, really dark, gritty, kind of grounded elements of danger that are found in this movie. And we'll get into, I mean, there is supernatural elements into this that we'll get into a little bit more later on in the video. But for the most part, this is like a grounded, kind of gritty thriller following Lee Harker. And it's just one of those things where the colors really play a big role into it. There's also religious imagery that is used, and we'll get into that a little bit later as well. But I think the comparisons of good and evil in this movie, as little as good there is, because this is a heavy on the bad guy side of things, but there's like that imagery that's there that kind of works as far as making this horror element filled movie, and I think that works for what the movie is going for. And lastly, the thing I want to get into that I liked about this movie, and I talked about it a little bit in one of my previous pros, but is the borrowed elements of other films that Longlegs kind of uses, but still stays true to itself as its own movie. You know what I mean? So one of the biggest comparisons I could make as far as Longlegs goes, in regards to tension, kind of comparing it to another movie, is if you're a big horror fan, you might have heard of a little movie called Sinister. And that movie is just known for, you know, elevating the heart rates a little bit. I think there was even a scientific study that said that it was one of the scariest movies based on heart rate. Don't quote me on that because I didn't go looking through the science of that. But what I can say is, as far as the tension goes on first viewing, this movie is much like Sinister, especially like one thing that is especially close to that is the way that Lee Harker, when she's doing her investigation, going through newspapers or anything like that, you definitely get that vibe of Sinister where Ethan Hawke's character in that movie is going through these old, you know, newspaper clippings, or he's going through these old videotapes and stuff like that. You really see similarities in that regard. You also see it in the score as far as like the kind of like the violent strings of a violin or some kind of guitar or anything like that, that those violent kind of hitting of a string or plucking of a string, that really plays a role into the tension, and I think that is done very well. The borrowed elements, like I said, also of like Silence of the Lambs, that kind of whole character study of Longlegs, kind of comparing it to Buffalo Bill. And Longlegs is its own thing, but the borrowed elements, just a tiny little borrowed elements of different films, really, really helps this movie kind of just run. This movie sets itself apart, but it has like elements for the horror fan, like for the person that's seen a lot of movies, a lot of horror movies. It has those elements from things that you could call back and be like, oh, okay, they're using this to do this, and I really enjoyed that. And like I said, I try to keep it a little somewhat vague so you guys can go enjoy it freely, kind of go in there blind, because I think that's the best way to enjoy this movie, and we'll get into that a little bit more as well. But definitely going into Longlegs as blind as you can on the situation, I think it's really going to heighten the experience. But yeah, that's one of the things that those borrowed elements in other movies is done very well. Just a side note, I think something that I didn't mention, but I should mention, and it probably goes without saying, is the characters are actually very, very well done. Nick Cage is, like I said, I usually like Nick Cage as an actor in most of his things. I just have a, you know, a fondness of Nick Cage, but in this movie he's like super unsettling. Like I was just like, Nick, he's not a good guy. Nick Cage is not a good guy in this movie, and he plays the role of that kind of like serial killer, that psycho kind of thing pretty well. Like he's up there with Ethan Hawke as far as unsettling characters go. Them taking a turn and doing that, Nick Cage did an exceptional job, and I, you know, commend the character of Lee Harker. I mean, it's really hard to portray like an FBI agent who's kind of out of her element, and I really am rooting for her to get through this situation, especially as things unravel. You're really pulling for her to be able to get through this situation. I think the character dynamics in this movie are done very well, and that's something that should be applauded. Now, getting into some of the cons of this movie, and these are, the more that I think about it, so I'm releasing this video a little bit delayed because I wanted to get a second viewing in. So I got a second viewing in before I kind of sat down and did this video. But getting into some of the cons is on my first viewing even, especially like if you're somebody that watches a lot of movies like me, there are a lot of like breadcrumbs that are thrown in there. And unfortunately, and I have it written in my notes, like when I was taking notes, I called some of like the major plot points. So I went to go watch this movie with a buddy of mine, and I turned and looked at him, and I underlined what I had written, and I called a major plot point kind of early. If you're somebody that's really good with patterns and somebody that's seen a lot of horror movies or somebody that's seen a lot of thriller movies, you kind of like see where they're going with it early. Now, if you're a casual moviegoer and you don't really like pay attention to stuff like that, then you might not catch it, and it's just going to be pretty enjoyable. But that was something that kind of was more apparent to me, because as soon as I saw a connection, I made a connection to something that one of the characters said about something else, and immediately I was like, this and this is going to happen, and this is probably going to happen. And that's something that kind of took me out of it. I was like, man, now I think this, and sure enough, boom, the thing happened, and I was like, well, okay. It didn't kill the movie for me, but it definitely is something to be aware of. If you're somebody that's like really into horror movies and you've seen a bunch of them, and you know the patterns that come with like your Sevens, your Silence of the Lambs, your, Sinister, stuff like that, you're going to catch on to certain things that they do. And that might be a little bit of a con. Another con that I have, and this is just a nitpick, and this isn't a spoiler or anything like that, but there's a part where Lee Harker it's like dark outside, and she's in her house, and she decides she wants to leave the windows open. Now, this isn't a real con of the movie. This is just something that I get upset about. Like, why are you leaving? You have curtains. I saw it on the second viewing. I saw it. You got curtains. Why are your wide open windows open so everybody can see you from the outside? It's pitch black out there, Lee. You can't see anything out there. They can see you, you can't see them. Close your curtain. What's the matter with you? That's just a Chuko thing. I don't know why are you doing that? Yeah, just to add to the scariness for the audience. Like, Lee, close your window. Another con I have is Oregon. Freaking Oregon. That's it. That's the con. In all seriousness though, I think my last con, and this one kind of plays into going into that second viewing, is the rewatchability and the fact that this movie is definitely not for everyone. Although on first watch, I think the strengths hit really, really well. And the movie was intense, and I was kind of like at the edge of my seat, and I really enjoyed it. On second viewing, I didn't really see much more that I enjoyed. Like, this film is heavily dependent on whether or not the rating that you could give this film is heavily dependent on whether or not you've seen it. Or if you're seeing it with somebody that's never seen it before, maybe that elevates it again for another viewing. But honestly, once you know like what's gonna happen, all those elements that were great the first time, they just kind of fall to the wayside. And I know that could be said about a lot of movies, but I think especially in this one, at least on my second viewing, I was just kind of like, okay, I want to see what I really enjoyed about this movie, and just kind of dissect it. And on my second viewing, yeah, the characters were still great, the tension is still there, but I found myself more inclined to see how people that haven't seen it reacted to the movie versus me actually enjoying it the second viewing. So I think rewatchability plays a little bit of a factor. I don't know how much of it you can rewatch. Maybe I need to put some time between viewings. Maybe 2 days isn't enough time between viewings for me to be entirely excited to watch it again. But yeah, that's something to be said. And then another thing is that I wouldn't recommend this movie to everyone. This is a pretty dark movie. Like, just to be completely brutally honest about it, this is a dark movie. Like I've said earlier, there's a lot of like good and evil, They try to make that balance, but it's not balanced at all. There's very little good in this movie. This is heavily on the evil side. Like, everything about it is just darkness and brooding and just grounded, kind of very, very dark story progressions, and it doesn't get any better. The heavy religious themes in this movie would be a turnoff, I think, to like people that are extremely religious. I wouldn't recommend it to somebody like that. Somebody that can't really see past like the darkness or the dark religious elements of it. This is something, like I said, needs to be said. It's not so much a con, it's more of a warning to the viewer. This really isn't for everybody. I wouldn't recommend this to like somebody that's super religious or that somebody that can't really. I think this could be a major turnoff to somebody like that, somebody that really doesn't like the darker aspects of filmmaking, kind of like that just never being anything bright in this movie. There's nothing positive that happens to Lee Harker other than like her trying to unravel this case. And there's nothing good about Nick Cage in this movie as far as him as a character. Everything about this movie is dark, and I can see that being a turnoff to some people. You know what I mean? Like, some people just need that little that light, you know, something at the end of the tunnel, and I feel like this movie doesn't have that. So that can be a although it wasn't really a con in my book, because I've seen a lot of horror movies and I've seen a lot of thrillers, and you kind of just, it doesn't bother me as much. I could see this being something that's an issue for the casual moviegoer, for somebody that really wants that light at the end of the tunnel. This is not for everybody. So guys, getting into my rating, this movie, I wish, the one thing that I do wish they had done a little bit better was kind of like picking the lane. So as I've said, and I don't think this is a spoiler or anything like that, there are supernatural elements that are introduced in this movie, and at first they're kind of sprinkled in, and I liked the idea of maybe it being something that's in their heads, like in the characters' heads, versus something that might actually be supernatural. I would have liked to have seen that balance a little bit better. They eventually pick what they want to do with it, and you know, you make your decision. That's fine as a movie goes, and it didn't really take away too much from the movie. But I wish there was a little bit more of a balance and kind of just leaving it up in the air for the audience to discover. But it really, like I said, it didn't really affect my viewing experience. I enjoyed the movie for what it is. It's a dark movie. Like I said, it's not something that's like super positive or anything like that, but it is a good thriller horror movie. And I really think, and maybe this just speaks to the movies that have been releasing this year, but other than Abigail on the horror front, I think this is probably the best of the year. As far as horror thrillers go. I mean, we still have a lot of year left, and I'm sure we have a lot of really good releases coming, but as far as horror goes, so far, this is probably best of the year, and I enjoyed this as far as tension goes. I was sitting there watching like, oh, okay, all right, what's gonna happen? Or, whoa, this guy's really dark, or whoa, this, whoa, that. I really sat there and I enjoyed this movie. I thoroughly enjoyed it as far as what it's doing well in this movie. The allegory of good and evil is there. They do that kind of like wolf in sheep's clothing kind of stuff. The presence of evil is engulfing in this movie. That's what I'm getting at. That's what it is. You know what I mean? It's just this foreboding presence, this tension, this despair kind of feeling that I think they were going for, and they executed well. If that's what, you know what I mean? Like, so if you're going in there understanding this, that they did that very well. There's little to no good, for lack of a better phrase, and the dark elements are definitely there. The performances are good, the tension is there, and for those that could sit through something like this, the actors did an excellent job in this movie. With that though, Chuko gives this one a 4 out of 5. Are you not entertained? On your first viewing, I think this score is subject to change depending on how many times I watch this movie. I was already kind of teetering with the score, but I do want to go off of what I thought right out of the gate, off of my first impression, off of my first viewing, because that's always when it's going to be the best. I went in there blind. I really enjoyed it. For those that are like really into horror or thrillers or anything like that, this is something that really continues to unravel, and it does it very well. The characters are dark. Everything about this movie is dark, but it's done well and it's executed. The scares are good. There's not too many jump scares, and when the jump scares are there, they're earned. And there's that sense of foreboding, that sense of, you know, hopelessness that you're really hoping Lee Harker can get out of. And I think this film is executed very, very well. I would highly recommend going in there blind if you can. And even if you've seen like aspects of the trailer or whatever, I still think that's enough for you to get in there and enjoy this movie. But what did you guys think of Longlegs? Do you agree with what I'm saying? Disagree with what I'm saying? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you're new to the channel, I'd really appreciate it if you like and share this video. Or if you want to see more from good old Chuko, I'd appreciate if you subscribe. I really appreciate all the support. But guys, if you're ever stuck in the woods of the Pacific Northwest, always remember something my friend Nick used to tell me, and that's